When we look back at the 1930s, we can see a clear path towards the inevitable outbreak of the Second World War. I think we can see that same path today, and that's terrifying. World War III looks not only possible today, but likely. As retired General Philip Ingram said, "I've never seen a clear path to things joining up into a global conflict. I can now, and we have to be very careful." It will be one of the most savage conflicts in human history, with new toys and tactics, grand, continent-wide battlefields, and the potential to quite literally end the world. In this video, I'm going to argue that there are 8 key factors that led to the outbreak of the Second World War, and that we can see all of those same factors in the world right now, today. We'll start with our first point: stagnating rising powers.
The waning might of ascendant realms.
So, the common narrative about how big wars start is that when a rising power meets an established or declining great power, a great power conflict is likely to emerge. When 2 great powers go to war, it's called a great power conflict. The last 2 great power conflicts were the First and Second World War. And of course, great power conflicts are absolutely devastating because each side has an enormous number of resources that they can throw into the war effort. I'll unpack the terminology a little bit just so everyone can follow, but if you're already aware, don't worry, I won't take very long here. A great power is a nation or country with considerable military strength and an international influence that stretches way beyond its immediate region. Think the USA today or the British Empire in its heyday. A rising power, as you've guessed, is a nation or state that's rapidly increasing in strength and influence, but isn't necessarily as strong as the established powers. Not yet, at least. When a rising power meets an established power, the likelihood is that they go to war. This phenomenon of war being likely between rising and established powers was coined the Thucydides trap by political scientist Graham T. Allison. During the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, Thucydides, an Athenian general, posited that the principal reason the 2 cities were at war was simply because of the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. You see where this is going. Athens, a rising power, eventually becomes strong enough to challenge Sparta, an established power. And then war becomes inevitable as both sides start to clash over strategic interests and fall into general paranoia about the intentions of the other power. You can see the same patterns play out during the rise of Germany against established European powers in the outbreak of the First World War, and the rise of Japan against the USA during the Second World War. Today, it's between China and America. But what if that's all wrong? See, this narrative paints the picture that major power conflicts only happen when the rising power is at its strongest. The reality is actually a bit more depressing. If we look back over the last century or so, we can see that rising powers become increasingly aggressive, not when they're at their height, but when they're just past it. Rising powers become dangerous when they start stagnating. This is known as imperial overstretch. See, when a rising power is on the upswing, it gets used to the gravy train. Its citizens get fat and comfortable and expect the good times to continue. Public sectors continue to expect the same level of investment they've enjoyed throughout the rising years, and the leaders become accustomed to dealing with economic surplus, which makes governance relatively easy. However, once the rising starts to stagnate, the leaders find themselves pushed on all sides to keep the good times coming, and a dizzying fall from power and grace suddenly makes itself visible. Citizens lose faith in their governments, public administrators apply pressure to fix the rot, and leaders themselves have to find solutions in a world where there are no easy answers. It's the danger zone, where countries get desperate for quick wins and are running out of time to get them. This is often called a window of opportunity, where a declining power has to act quickly with the little remaining strength it has before it falls into powerlessness and irrelevance. This pressure to deliver on continual growth is exactly what happened during the Second World War. By the time of the outbreak of World War II, both of the rising powers, Japan and Germany, were already beginning to stagnate. By the time the National Socialist Party had come to power, Germany wasn't doing too hot at all. However, the opening years of Bad Moustache Man's reign were relatively positive, with a huge rearmament campaign and some quick strategic and territorial wins on Germany's immediate border. However, this growth was ultimately unsustainable, which is why Germany was paying its arms manufacturers with a fake currency called Mifo bills instead of actual money, In the short term, this allowed them to tap into huge economic growth, but in the long term became an issue. Fake money isn't a substitute for actual growth, and so by 1939, Germany faced the same problems that it had since the Treaty of Versailles, signed 20 years before. A lack of natural resources, a poor agricultural sector, and an enormous debt burden. Desperate to keep his pledge of stability and comfort to the German people, desperate to acquire more natural resources and agricultural land to prop up his fake economy, Hitler saw the window of opportunity beginning to close and decided to roll the dice by invading Poland to deliver on his promise of Lebensraum, the idea of a living space for the German people to cultivate and flourish within. He had gambled, wrongly, that Britain and France wouldn't intervene, but they did, and the Second World War had begun. Not by a rising power destined to skyrocket past the established powers, but instead by a once rising power now on a rapid decline and on a collision course with ruin. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the same pattern of growth, stagnation, and aggression would play out in Japan. During the late 19th and early 20th century, Imperial Japan was a rising power and a formidable one. After defeating Russia and China in regional conflicts, Japan had made impressive territorial gains in Asia, with juicy imperial outposts like Korea and Taiwan. Through her considerable military might, large imperial territories, and rapid homeland industrialization, Japan was set for a century of good times. But then the Great Depression came. Japan, who relied mostly on an export economy, especially silk, to facilitate growth, suddenly found itself in a world market with no buyers. The stagnation set in, and Japan would have to look elsewhere to ensure the continual growth it enjoyed for the last 50 or so years. That answer came in the form of the invasion of Manchuria and the establishment of a maritime empire across the Pacific. In response to their aggression in the East and the violation of international norms, the US enforced an oil embargo on Japan, cutting off 80% of their access to oil overnight. In order to protect their access to this vital resource, Japan concluded they would have to capture territories with significant reserves in Southeast Asia. This capture of Southeast Asian territories would almost certainly mean war with the US, a war that Japan, a once rising but now stagnating power, would probably lose. The window of opportunity was closing. The answer was to roll the dice in Pearl Harbor and try to knock the American war effort off the map before it even managed to declare itself in the fight. It was ultimately unsuccessful, and America in turn would chase the Japanese empire all the way back to its homeland and then drop 2 atomic bombs to force a surrender. But the key point is that both of the principal aggressors in the Second World War were rising powers that had already begun to stagnate. Today, the 2 rising powers which are challenging the international order, Russia and China, are both stagnating powers. The statement that Russia is a rising power might seem strange, because it hasn't even come close to being a peer competitor to the United States since the Cold War. But Russia does behave like a rising power that's begun to stagnate. I know some of you will find this ridiculous, so let me park this for a while and I will come back to it later in the video. For now though, let's look at China. China is a stagnating power, and it has a rapidly closing window of opportunity, which is why most analysts tell us that China is likely to make a move on Taiwan around a specific date, usually in the late 2020s. If we can get past that date without conflict, we're likely to avoid a major war, because China will have missed its chance to exert what strength it has remaining, and we will have successfully moved past the danger zone. But saying China is a stagnant power is also likely to raise some eyebrows, so I'll expand. I think that with just a glancing look at some bread and butter domestic issues, we can see that China is in real trouble, and it has serious problems that aren't going to just disappear. One of the major strengths that China has enjoyed during its rising years is its demographic makeup. In recent decades, China has had a relatively young population, which is great for economic growth. In the early 2000s, China had 10 working age people for each retiree. 10 years from now, that number will shrink to a measly 2.5 working age people per pensioner, putting an enormous strain on the working population to support an ever-increasing section of the populace who no longer work and rely on expensive and labour-intensive care to stay alive. This rapid gutting of the working age population was mainly caused by China's one-child policy, which has since been scrapped and in some parts of China openly reversed, with some regions, such as Guangdong, offering families up to 30,000 yuan, around $4,000, for their second and third child. It's unfortunately a case of too little, too late, however, and most experts predict that despite these policies, China's population will contract by 200 million, nearly 20%, by the middle of the century. China also faces a stark, almost comical environmental crisis at home, which will continue to hamper growth and affect those living within China as its stagnation sets in and it becomes increasingly unable to answer problems that to many countries would already be fatal. For instance, 50% of river water and 90% of groundwater in China is officially recognised as unfit to drink. To make matters worse, 25% of river water and 60% of groundwater is so bad that the Chinese government called it unfit for human contact and can't be used for any agriculture or industry. Just let those numbers sink in. Nearly half of all the water in China is unfit for human contact. It's not that you can't drink it, it's that any contact with it at all would be harmful for you. I mean, it's just water. It doesn't seem like that huge of a deal, but this issue, as of today, is costing the Chinese government $140 billion a year on water scarcity and opportunity cost. And again, $140 billion that a weaker and weaker China is going to have to fork out for on a resource as basic as water. China is also importing more and more food as its own arable land has become degraded after decades of ultra-intensive farming. Since the 2000s, roughly 40% of arable farmland has been lost. Just in 2022 alone, an area the size of Belgium went from semi-arable land to arid wastelands, bringing the border of the Gobi Desert now just 50 kilometers from China's capital of Beijing. Food isn't the only thing they'll be importing either. China currently imports 75% of its energy, which comes with an eye-watering price tag of $500 billion every year, about 3% of its entire GDP. 3% of GDP, just to keep the lights on. Now, of course, when times are good, these kinds of expenses are pennies on the dollar. But in a world where China's strength and domestic growth are hampered, it could very easily find itself without access to basic goods such as food, water, and energy, a critical weakness for a rising power. So, altogether, this is what we mean when we talk about a closing window of opportunity. It's tempting for China to roll the dice now and make some major strategic wins so that it can secure its position as a rising power in the future. A China which controls Taiwan, for instance, will be able to secure a crucial extension of China's strategic depth by turning Taiwan into an unsinkable aircraft carrier that will give China unprecedented power in the region, as well as an effective monopoly on microchip production, allowing China to decide who does and who does not get access to some of the most important components for modern electronics. Microchips, by the way, are in everything from smartphones to cars to medical equipment and, of course, nearly all state-of-the-art military technology. If China ever found itself in trouble, controlling Taiwan's geography and industry would unlock a failsafe against its major strategic weaknesses, allowing China to protect the crucial food and energy imports, whilst also holding the microchip industry as some punchy leverage against any would-be adversaries. But of course, China has a limited window of time before it loses the necessary strength to challenge Taiwan, which means that right now, we're in the danger zone, just like Britain and France were in 1939 and the USA was in 1941. So it isn't rising powers that go to war with established powers, but instead stagnating powers that sometimes go to war when they feel insecure about their place on the global stage. But what is it that turns rising powers into stagnating ones? That's where we move to my second point, global financial crises.
The depletion of worldly coinage.
If we look at the moments leading up to World War II and a possible World War III today, they're both preceded by a major economic collapse in the decade or so before the conflict. Global financial crises are bad news for peace because they frustrate the growth of rising powers whilst also stoking insecurity within established powers. Of course, in the 1930s you had the Great Depression, which, as we mentioned, destabilised Germany's economy even further, leading to the rise of the National Socialist Party and also robbed Imperial Japan of her export markets, leading to increased desperation to protect growth by any means necessary, even if that meant invading Manchuria to forcibly open new markets. That same economic turbulence that characterised the years before the outbreak of World War II can now be seen in our recent past. starting of course with the 2008 financial crisis, which led to a global recession, and then 2 years of economic calamity during COVID-19, in which global production ground to an almost complete halt, whilst governments took out eye-watering loans to invest in vaccination programs, hospital staffing, and furlough schemes to make sure those who couldn't work were still paid. China was hit especially hard by these economic developments. In fact, it's impossible to properly tell the story of China as a rising and then stagnating power without factoring in the economic realities of the last 50 or so years. Between 1970 and 2007, China's world trade grew sixfold, a staggering economic achievement which skyrocketed a relatively agrarian, poverty-stricken nation into a formidable global power, lifting millions out of abject poverty. Not only that, but during those same years, China was able to leverage its low production costs to multiply growth that it received from trade by nearly 30 times its original level. This is economic rocket fuel. But then the financial crash of 2008 started to bite into world trade, and China's economic special sauce began to turn sour. Since 2008, China's trade shrank, both in export volume and as a proportion of economic prosperity generated from it. To stem the bleed, China took out more and more debt to stabilise the interruption in trade. China's debt grew by 8 times its 2008 figure within just over a decade. To make matters worse, China's total factor productivity, possibly the most important metric by which a national economy can be judged, has gotten worse, considerably worse. Since 2008, China's total factor productivity has declined by 1.3% every single year, which means they're spending more money to produce less things. Then came COVID, which obliterated the export backbone of China's economy as the global financial engines stalled to a near-perfect halt. Chinese GDP contracted by nearly 7% in the first quarter of 2020, the first decline of this kind for decades. And whilst China failed to meet the export demands of essential equipment like PPE, other countries, which once imported these goods solely from China, started to diversify their supply chains, relying less on an unreliable China and more on their manufacturing competitors. While not a direct mirror of events in China, Russia's export market was also hit considerably hard during the 2008 financial crisis, during which the price of oil, one of Russia's major exports, dropped from $140 per barrel to around a measly $40. Russia's stock market lost approximately 70% of its value in 2008, and GDP contracted by 7.8% in 2009. Unemployment surged and capital flight intensified as international investors pulled out, leaving the country with the meat pinched out of its sandwich. Domestically, the economic crisis tested the legitimacy of Vladimir Putin's government, which had previously enjoyed popularity due to consistent economic growth. While the Kremlin avoided widespread public unrest through fiscal measures like spending from its sovereign wealth funds, public confidence in its economy declined. Internationally, the crisis limited Russia's capacity to project power, as reduced revenues constrained its military modernization efforts and economic influence over neighboring states. Russia, which had been a lesser rising power since Putin took control, had begun to stagnate and began to look elsewhere for its own security, rather than relying solely on good relations with other global powers, which had proven to be unreliable sources of secure economic growth. So, both World War II and our current period see a pattern in which rising powers begin to assert themselves on the world stage, but are sidelined by a global economic crisis and then begin to stagnate. Now, there is no guarantee that a stagnating power will become aggressive or even engage in any rash geopolitical dice rolling, but unfortunately, there's another factor which changed the way that these powers reacted to the circumstances in the run-up to World War II, and they could play out the exact same way today. And that's my third point, the consolidation of power, from many to one.
The ascent of one above all.
During the years leading up to the Second World War, both Germany and Japan, the rising powers, saw a collapse in their democratic institutions and the concentration of more and more power into fewer and fewer hands. Today, we see the same pattern, with both Russia's Putin and China's Xi wielding more and more power as the system of politburos and collective decision-making collapses within their political system. In Germany, the bad moustache man was sworn in as Chancellor in 1933, giving the National Socialist Party their first taste of legitimate political power. Within less than 2 months, Hitler seized emergency powers after a fire in Germany's government buildings, and around a year later, during the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had cleansed all of his political rivals in a purge of his own party, effectively turning Germany into a full dictatorship led by one man. In Japan, things were slightly more complex, but yielded effectively the same result, with the military effectively gaining full control of the country and answering to one man and one man alone, an army bureaucrat named Hideki Tojo. Likewise, today, we see the weakening of collective rule in Russia and China, and the concentration of power into a single pair of hands. It would, of course, be ridiculous to say that China has abandoned its democratic systems. It's never had any, although there were some unsuccessful attempts during the turbulence of the early 20th century. Nonetheless, there has still been a monumental shift in the way that power is wielded. Since the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, China began building a political system which required leaders to share power and to transition in and out of power peacefully. Decisions were made by consensus of the Politburo, and each leader was limited to 2 5-year terms. China's political system was still authoritarian, but it had enough checks and balances to prevent anyone from wielding complete power. That all changed in 2012, when Xi Jinping ascended to the position of secretary and then began systematically undermining the political norms that had characterized China's Politburo system for the last 30 or so years. Xi began placing those who were personally loyal to him in positions of influence, whilst on the other hand began purging any perceived rivals under the guise of anti-corruption campaigns. By 2018, he'd amassed enough power and influence to get the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee to amend the constitution, scrapping the 2-term limit on rulers and effectively allowing Xi to become dictator for life. Ditto for Putin, although for the past 20 or so years, Russia has attempted to present itself as a democracy, although that is only true in name. What is true is that since the death of Joseph Stalin, Russia has more or less been ruled by politburos, much like China after Mao. A Politburo, by the way, if you wasn't sure, is essentially a collection of senior politicians who work collectively to come to decisions and develop new policies. Although they do have their leaders who shape the direction of these policies, there is still some sharing of power. Politburos don't have the same system of collective decision-making processes that you see in democracies, but they're not quite one-man rule. There are still some checks and balances within the system. But then came the collapse of the USSR in 1991 and a decade of turbulence and democratic experimentation, which all ended when Vladimir Putin emerged as president in 2000 after a landslide democratic victory. Putin began immediately consolidating his own power and undermining the democratic systems that had delivered him to office, restricting the rights of the press and cracking down on political dissent. This gradual wearing down of democratic norms and the sharing of power within politburos allowed Putin to effectively rule Russia by himself. And in 2020, he also amended the constitution so that he could rule until 2036, essentially making him dictator for life as well. But why does any of this matter? Why have I spent the last 5 minutes talking about how each of these dictators have risen to power and then dismantled their systems so that they can wield all of it by themselves? Well, it's because dictators behave differently. You see, for a democratically elected or Politburo-favoured leader, your job is to deliver on the promises you made to whoever voted you in, and then keep approval ratings high so that you can get re-elected for a second term. Once your second term is up, you're done, and you can either retire or find another line of work. For a dictator, however, your job is to stay alive, and the way to do that is to stay in power. You might pick up the crown expecting a life of luxury and power. In reality, you've just entered a life of paranoia, suspicion, fear, mistrust, brutality, scheming, backstabbing, and endless machination. And the only way to defend yourself against all these threats on all sides is to continue wielding that exact same power, which makes you a target. You become dependent on power for your own personal safety. This is because when you take complete power over a nation, you'll be forced to do unpleasant things, especially to those who want you gone. It's very easy for a dictator to make enemies, and it's not always easy to know who is an enemy and who is a friend. Since there are no elections, no checks and balances of any kind to get you out of office, then if people have had enough of you, you as a dictator will have to be forcibly removed through coups, revolution, or external force. In other words, there's many ways in to becoming a dictator. There's only one way out. Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by his colleagues. Charles I was beheaded by Parliament. Gaddafi was dragged out of a sewage pipe and shot by rebels after losing a civil war. Saddam Hussein was put on trial and sentenced to death after he lost power. Hitler ate his own pistol in a bunker in Berlin. Mussolini was strung upside down by his own countrymen. A week before his birthday, Hideki Tojo was killed by hanging for his crimes during World War II. The most effective dictators died peacefully, but still on the job. Joseph Stalin from a stroke in 1953, Mao Zedong of a heart attack in 1976. Dictators don't retire. Dictators die. Effective dictators pass away while they're leader and then they lose power. Ineffective dictators lose power and are then killed. And there are very few exceptions to this rule. This matters because it frames every major geopolitical decision through the lens of personal safety. To a dictator, it doesn't matter whether your death blow comes at the hands of your own people, at the hands of a foreign invader, or under the shadow of a mushroom cloud. In either case, you lose. Let's just look at the decision chart for a dictator who is considering invading another country in order to solidify his power and avoid ruin. If he doesn't invade, he remains unpopular because he is unable to provide goods to his citizens and power brokers, and so he dies. If he invades and wins, he gets to keep his power. If he invades and loses, he dies, the same as if he hadn't invaded. Providing there's a reasonable chance of success, and providing that there's a legitimate threat that he'll lose his power without making the strategic gain that's required by war, he will choose war, even if that means sending thousands to die.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
The kind of people who are attracted to dictatorial power are not the kind to wince at the thought of people fighting and dying in order to keep you safe and in control. For a dictator, all bets are off when their power is threatened, which makes a world full of dictators a dangerous place. This is why there is an entire school of international relations called liberalism, which aims to spread democracy to all the corners of the globe, with the ultimate goal of establishing world peace, since democracies are unlikely to go to war with one another. Unlike liberals, there is another school, the realists, who see peace as a moving target, which is not necessarily guaranteed by international democracy. Realists believe the key to peace is to establish a balance of power, so that no one power can realistically make strategic gains at the expense of the other, since the other powers, equally balanced, would be able to check their aggression. Political realists see the world through the lens of balancing powers, which means robust international alliances, and that brings me onto my next point. Axes and axes, challenging the world order.
Axes and axes. The sundering of worldly accord.
Before we jump right into this factor though, let's just have a quick recap of how the world looks almost exactly how it did before World War II. So, 1. Rising powers looking to challenge the international world order are in fact stagnating powers with rapidly closing windows of opportunity to claim their spot on the world stage. 2. These rising, but now stagnant powers have had their growth and stability frustrated by global economic crises. 3. The rising stagnant powers have seen a monumental shift of power from a system of politburos and limited powers to a system in which one man rules indefinitely. The next stage is to establish an axis, an alliance of rising or competing powers who wish to work together and rely on each other to challenge the existing world order. During the run-up to World War II, it was Germany, Italy and Japan. Today, it's Russia, China and Iran. We didn't have time in this video to show Khomeini's rise to power in Iran. It's complicated, and in all honesty, I need to do my homework on the subject before any further discussion on that topic, but Iran is part of this new axis, and so it must be mentioned. In a peaceful world, an effective axis provides a balance of powers to the international order, which allows them to check the adversarial powers' strength as they rely on each other to overcome embargoes and sanctions and combine their military might in order to subdue their opposition. During the Second World War, Germany exchanged much of its military technology with Japan in exchange for critical resources and raw materials, which were smuggled into German war machine through neutral countries and covert operations. And when the Italian campaigns in North Africa failed to bear fruit, Germany joined in the struggle in order to try and stabilise the effort and assist Italy in achieving its strategic goals. Likewise today, the established Axis works together to check the Western powers. Russia's invasion of Ukraine would have been followed by the near immediate financial death throes of the Kremlin as Russia became isolated from the international financial system. However, China came in to buy Russian oil in yuan rather than dollars in order to help reduce the effect of sanctions on Russia and also create an alternative economic system based on a currency other than the US dollar. As of 2022, Russia became China's primary source of oil, a huge win for the Kremlin and a strategic win for China, who can now rely on Russian oil bought in Chinese yuan if they ever find themselves under an embargo by Western-aligned nations. Iran has also stepped in to strengthen its own hand while securing Russia's, trading its own armaments to help Russia prosecute its war in Ukraine in exchange for raw materials like oil and gas, which in turn can be re-exported out of Iranian ports and sent to anywhere in the world, reinforcing this alternative economic system. The Axis powers can continue to trade and protect their own access to resources without being held to account by Western sanctions. To complete the triad, China and Iran tied the knot in 2021, signing a 25-year cooperation agreement, whereby both countries will focus on building infrastructure development and energy exchanges between the two nations. But the cooperation isn't merely economic. In 2019, Russia, China and Iran shared in joint military exercises both in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Oman. These events, compounding on one another, are also taking a concerning resemblance to the cooperation between Axis powers during World War II. In 1940, the Axis powers signed the Tripartite Act, formally pledging that each nation would come to the assistance of others if a new belligerent entered the war. No such pledge exists yet between China, Russia and Iran, even with Xi recently declaring that China's friendship with Russia has no limits. So the Axis is not formally recognised as it was during World War II, but there is a key way in which this new Axis mirrors the old one, with worrying implications for the likelihood of peace in our time. See, while these axes are able to help one another duck, weave and counter their adversaries' efforts, they're not quite as united as you might think. In reality, both the previous and current axes are united by short-term strategic necessity, but ultimately divided by longer-term goals. Each member of the triad is primarily interested in their own power and security, and distrust, miscommunication, and differing long-term objections make real, coordinated strategic cooperation almost impossible. There is a reason that the Tripartite Act of 1940 only required each Axis member to enter the fight if a new belligerent entered the war, because Germany was already at war with France and Britain and felt pressured to improvise to bolster its own position. Japan, on the other hand, had no interest in declaring war on France or Britain during 1940. But then came Pearl Harbor, which dragged America into the conflict and forced Germany and Italy to declare war on a nation which had no direct interest in fighting another European war. Interestingly, when Germany had invaded Russia earlier that same year, Japan had in fact not come to the aid of Germany against a new enemy and instead chose to remain neutral. Not the loyalty or cooperation you would expect from an Axis alliance determined to undermine the established world order. The Axis may have made each member seem stronger, but in reality, it just emboldened each leader to make more and more reckless decisions in the belief that it could lean on its allies to tag team their issues whenever things got tough. Powers will only join an Axis if it feels that there is something to gain from the relationship, and in the face of strategic ruin, which for a dictator is the same as death, it's tempting to annul or creatively interpret your strategic agreements, which is almost exactly what happened after China and Russia announced their friendship with no limits. Putin, who felt secure in his alliance with China, felt he had enough ducks in a row to invade Ukraine and also dodge the international backlash. China, however, was less keen to support Russia than expected, and she started to get buyer's remorse. Unwilling to demonize itself within Western circles, nor to break the important strategic relationship with Russia, Beijing has taken a rather pale stance of neutrality. Not quite the united front that other Axis members may have been betting on, and not the behaviour you would expect from a rising state anxious to establish its influence on the world stage. And so, just like in the lead up to World War II, we see that loose agreements of mutual cooperation between dictators makes the world more dangerous, as leaders feel emboldened by a new balance of power and roll the dice on bigger and bigger strategic gambles before falling flat on their face. Because a loose axis doesn't make each of the members more likely to win during a confrontation, it just makes them more likely to fall into tremendous blunders, a dangerous proposition when the likely outcome is military conflict. But while these axes may exist to challenge the world order, there has to, of course, be a world order that needs to be challenged. And that brings me on to my next point. 5. The failure of international organizations.
The ruin of assembled kingdoms.
The years leading to the Second World War were characterised by a failure of international organisations to deal with global crises. In the aftermath of the First World War, the League of Nations was established by Woodrow Wilson. It ran like a kind of precursor to the UN, wherein countries would consult the League of Nations in order to mediate disputes and prevent war. It was one of the first attempts to develop an international rules-based order where nations had set expectations for behaviour which could be enforced by every other League member. The reality was almost one of comical failure. Despite being the brainchild of US President Wilson, America never entered the League, creating an enormous power vacuum within the League and an inability for any of its rules to be properly enforced. Within 2 decades of its formation, the Axis powers withdrew and the League faced death by 1,000 cuts as more and more nations began to violate the rules-based order. First in March of 1933, when Japan left the League after facing criticism for its invasion of Manchuria. Then, in October of that same year, Germany pulled out after Hitler faced challenges for his rearmament of the German military, which was expressly forbidden in the Treaty of Versailles. 4 years later, in 1937, the last of the Axis powers withdrew. Italy, after the League of Nations attempted to oppose some relatively minor sanctions in response to its invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The League had failed to keep everyone in the club, and any hopes of a rules-based order that could operate effectively was dashed. It should go without saying that the League of Nations' primary failure wasn't the fact that the Axis powers left, but that at each time they violated the international rules, the League was powerless to act. Japan was able to pursue imperial conquest in Manchuria unchecked. Germany was allowed to build the most dangerous army on earth at the time with virtually no resistance. And Italy was permitted to invade a nation on an entirely different continent, only to face the most half-hearted sanctions, which didn't even include key resources like oil. The League had been unable to enforce the rules, and as a consequence of its lackluster sanctions, it had driven the Axis powers to rely on each other to establish their own alternative to the League of Nations and present a greater threat than they could have possibly hoped to by themselves. Ultimately, however, this axis was unsuccessful, and after being vanquished in 1945, a new international organisation was developed, the UN, which had more or less the same mission statement as the League of Nations, but with a new modus operandi, moulded by the painful lessons of the 1930s. Unlike the League, the UN would have universal inclusion, so that all nations could, would, and should have a seat at the table. Putting the Cold War aside, the UN has been relatively effective, but despite these areas of relative success, the UN has spent the last 2 decades struggling to enforce that same rules-based order that it's designed to protect, and seems to be increasingly unable to keep up with modern challenges, exacerbated by a developing axis. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the United Nations was left hamstrung in its attempts to respond to Russian aggression. Part of the reason that this happened is because Russia is one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, along with the United States, United Kingdom, France and China. These 5 nations, known as the P5 members, hold the right to veto any action agreed upon by the UN Security Council, which is exactly what Russia did when on the 26th of February 2022, 2 days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United Nations Security Council tried to pass a resolution which demanded that Moscow cease its invasion and withdraw all of its soldiers from Ukraine. The resolution was shot down instantly by Russia's veto, leaving the Security Council toothless, and instead, the UN General Assembly would pass a non-binding resolution demanding Russia's withdrawal, which is in effect public condemnation and nothing more. The UN is an immensely complicated machine with an unthinkably difficult objective, and I would be lying to you if I told you that I understood its processes and mechanisms, and I'm not trying to criticise the UN. I simply don't know enough about it. What does seem obvious, though, is that the United Nations is becoming increasingly powerless in the world as multipolar interests and veto rights create deadlocks in crises such as Yemen, Ukraine, and Myanmar. Even when it comes to a firm agreement within itself, not much seems to happen, such as the 2016 arbitration ruling that China's claim to a 9-dash line in the South China Sea is in fact not legitimate and has no basis under international law. In response, China refused to acknowledge the court's ruling and has continued, as before, to build up its military and civilian presence in contested areas. This could be the beginning of a slippery slope, wherein the UN becomes less and less of a factor in international relations, and conflict, or the threat of it, becomes the sole means for competing states to mediate their differences, just like in World War II. But there's another factor that drives these competing powers faster and faster on the path towards collision. And that's point 6, ideological clashes between great powers.
The discord of doctrines twixt lords.
World War II, without a doubt, is the war that best captures our imagination. It's just such a huge stage of events, the bloodiest war in human history, fought from the sweltering jungles of Burma to the icy fjords of Norway, under the waters of the Atlantic and in the clouds above a battered Britain. The conflict found itself everywhere. It was also very recent and quite literally shaped the world order we live in today. But it's not just the numbers, the places, the consequences, or even the characters that draw so many of us into World War II. It's the struggle of these great, violent, mobilizing ideologies that defined the era. It was a war of ideas, a bare-knuckle slugging match between good and evil, with a clear winner. A lot of academic disciplines that are tangential to war and peace, like political science, international relations, and economics, tend to see the world through a materialist lens, paying little attention to the ideas that galvanize our great historic moments. In an interview with Lex Friedman, the renowned and highly influential international relations theorist John Mearsheimer even suggested that the Second World War would still have played out more or less the same way if Germany hadn't been led by Hitler or his fascist ideology. I think that this is a gross underestimation of the power that ideas have. The world doesn't shape our ideas, it's our ideas that shape the world. If you're not sure about that, close your eyes and imagine a world in which human beings had never existed. It will be vastly different to the one that we inhabit. We may just be primates, but we're primates with ideas, and ideas are powerful things. No time was this clearer than the Second World War. It had the full spectrum of ideas, the toxic, race-based doctrine of fascism, which named Bolshevik communism, another big idea, as its mortal enemy. We had an imperial theocracy in Japan based around the emperor, who was believed to be God on earth. And then we had Britain, desperately trying to mount some kind of moral stance against Germany and Japan, whilst also trying to square her own conscience with her empire. We had a broken France, shaped by liberté, égalité, and fraternité, but forced to collaborate with Nazi occupiers. And finally, a democratic America, powerful, but reluctant to engage in another European war. Whoever won the Second World War would not just have new territories and wealth, but would have triumphed in an ideological struggle, and would inherit a brand new world with drastic, possibly catastrophic changes to our values and the moral universe that we live in. If fascism had won, I dread to imagine how our world would look today, considering the brutal genocide against the Jewish people, the Polish, and the countless other enemies or so-called lesser people of Europe, and the unthinkable treatment of the Chinese, Koreans, and other subjugated people under the Japanese Empire, which, when you hear specific details, managed to somehow be even more chilling and gut-wrenching than the horrors of the Nazi regime, but in a totally different way. It was just all so awful. Instead, and to humanity's everlasting relief. The victors had not in fact been the fascist Axis, but the Western Allies and Communist Russia, both of which then carved the world into two very different spheres, each with their own values, their own sense of right and wrong, their own ideas about what freedoms people should and shouldn't have, and how people should relate to each other and the state. It was a war of ideas as much as it was a war for resources, prestige, personalities, or security anxiety. If World War III were to happen tomorrow, it would take on the same moral character as both sides scrambled to prevail in the struggle that will define the political realities of the future. But it's not like a war actually needs to start before the ideological fault lines start to appear. During the delicate peace of the interwar years, both Nazi Germany and Communist Russia were keen to export their political doctrines to other states, causing turmoil within the cultures of many European nations. Nowhere was this more exemplified than Spain, which broke into civil war in the summer of 1936. In this conflict, Spain was plunged into violence between the right-wing nationalist forces under Francisco Franco and the left-wing coalition of Republicans and intellectuals. Italy and Germany moved quickly to supply the nationalist Franco with brand new toys to smash the Republicans into pieces. Stalin, on the other hand, saw the simmering left-wing forces under the Republicans as a chance to spread his own brand of Bolshevism further into Western Europe and armed the Republicans with both ideological and material firepower. George Orwell, the author of 1984, was a combatant in the Spanish Civil War. He volunteered to fight for the Republican forces, motivated by a desire to stop the spread of fascism and totalitarianism. To his horror, he soon found that the Spanish Republicans had been ideologically corrupted by Stalinism. The democratic socialism that he'd been willing to bleed and spill blood for had now become just as totalitarian and morally bankrupt as the fascists he had hoped to defeat. Even unrelated civil wars in faraway countries would find their own disputes influenced, perhaps even defined, by the desire to export political ideologies from rising powers to lesser ones. And this is true, once again, today. It's not at all controversial to say that for the last 30 or so years, the US-led world order has been more than keen to spread the ideals of democracy and freedom around the world. The controversial invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent 20 years of folly in Afghanistan are perhaps the most astute testaments to this impulse. Although you could argue that both wars were instigated with the best of reasons, the West had failed to understand the difficult reality of trying to build shiny new political institutions to safeguard overnight democracies in what have historically been authoritarian states. The result was a catastrophic loss of life and the legacy of international condemnation. Likewise, although in less explicit ways, China is also keen to export its own brand of techno-authoritarianism to other countries. Authoritarian regimes such as Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Cambodia currently rely on technology provided by China to run their own regimes, strengthening their reign by relying on facial recognition technology, advanced surveillance, and enormous data drawn from an unthinkably regular and egregious invasion of basic privacy norms. In Hal Brand's and Michael Beckley's book, The Danger Zone, they point out that China has recently been rolling out these authoritarian technologies as a mandatory part of basic infrastructure investment into developing countries, forcing weak states interested in basic information technology to also accept the kind of surveillance systems that would make Big Brother jealous. When Ecuador received Chinese-built 911 emergency response technology, they found the system also came with cameras capable of facial recognition, and it's been put to good use. Uganda has also been using Huawei-provided technology to monitor and arrest political opponents. Techno-authoritarianism is on the rise, and that's because China is actively attempting to export its own political ideology and toolkit to an international audience. All of this means that, like in World War II, there is a fundamental incompatibility between the established liberal democratic powers, like the USA and Europe, and the rising, closed, authoritarian axis, like Russia and China, both of whom see their adversaries as attempting to spread their own political doctrines at the expense of the other. This creates two problems. Not only does it make war more likely, as both sides begin to see the other as existential threats to their values and way of life, but it makes any potential conflict that much more bitter and costly. I mentioned earlier that there are many reasons that the Second World War was able to capture attention so well, and another reason for that is the near apocalyptic attitude that the Axis powers began to take as the war was coming to its inevitable finale. It's that same apocalyptic, end-of-the-world attitude that motivated Japan to shove 17-year-old boys into planes packed with explosives and told them to nosedive into American ships. It's that same outlook that motivated these boys to agree to the suicide missions. Ultimately, the Second World War wouldn't be wrestled to its final conclusion until the USA dropped atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, wiping out hundreds of thousands of people in mere minutes. Many within the American establishment believed, and still believe, that the use of atomic weapons on civilians was an acceptable, perhaps even humane, way to end the war, because the alternative was to feed millions of Allied servicemen into a meat grinder, backed by a regime that had no ethical qualms about sending children onto the front line. Let that sink in for a moment. The fighting was so extreme that the American government genuinely believed it would be saving lives by dropping nuclear weapons on Japan. Not just once, but twice. Nuclear weapons, saving lives, in the same sentence. It's an almost unthinkable situation to ponder. In a struggle like World War II, the enemy at the gate does not represent a strategic or economic threat, but a moral one, and must be vanquished at any cost. Defeat would mean the end of life as you know it. Of course, nations and leaders have always relied on some kind of moral outrage or justification to encourage soldiers to take up arms and fight with purpose. But World War II took this impulse to a completely different level. And you can see that same determined, moralized, apocalyptic attitude towards warfare today in Ukraine. Literally. Russia has used the accusation of Nazi presence within the Ukrainian government as the main motivation for its invasion since the start, using the precedent of the very issue we've just discussed to rally its men, learning from history and actually choosing to repeat it. And as we said, when conflicts are framed as a bitter struggle between angelic good and satanic evil, things get ugly. Look at this. Although I can't verify the legitimacy of this document, I recently came across its picture. It's an instruction manual for Russian soldiers based in Ukraine. The manual provides details on the best way to end your life so you can avoid capture or surrender. Included are details such as how to shoot yourself in the head and where on your body to hold a live grenade. I don't doubt its veracity because I've seen a lot of other sources talking about the rise of this phenomenon amongst Russian troops in Ukraine. Soldiers, through brainwashing or misguided personal belief, have come to the conclusion that it would be better to die than be captured by the Ukrainians, either because the Ukrainians are evil and torture Russian POWs, or because it's beneath the dignity and honour of a Russian soldier to surrender to a lesser army. It's almost a direct mirror of Imperial Japan's propaganda during the struggling defence of the Pacific Islands, where the attitude was that surrender is the worst thing you can do because your enemy is subhuman and will torture you anyway. It's better for you to die by your own hand than to give up the fight and return home a failure. As if to prove my point, the last line of the Russian suicide document rings the same note. Remember, you are a warrior of Greater Russia. Your honour is your steadfastness until the end. So yes, World War III will be a moral struggle. But it won't just be the Western powers pulling out the ethical firepower for this conflict. While the US-led world order will paint the Axis as an authoritarian scourge that must be stood against for the sake of democracy, decency, and a free liberal culture based on respect for human rights, the Axis will respond in turn, painting the Western powers as intervening, decadent bullies who keep the Ukrainian and Russian people apart by force, prevent the reunification of the Chinese mainlanders with their Taiwanese brothers, and commit the greatest hypocrisy, droning on about a rules-based order whilst being all too happy to break those same rules at a moment's notice. But ideological unrest isn't just confined to the world stage. We can find the same divisions domestically, much closer to home, just like we did in the lead up to World War II. And that's point 7, political division within great powers.
Tumult within the mighty realms.
While World War II saw a tremendous moral struggle between the belligerents, there was also a fantastic struggle within many of them. Like today, politics within the power brokers had become bipolar and ineffective. It goes without saying that the Axis powers rode a wave of political tribalism and discontentment all the way to the highest seats in office. Mussolini marched on Rome with his fascist supporters, forcing the Italian monarch to appoint him to power in a bloodless coup. Adolf Hitler spent nearly 10 years undermining the democratic institutions within Germany before being able to ride to power on the back of some popular support, at which point he immediately abolished the democratic process and made Germany a dictatorship. The Japanese military was able to assassinate the ruling prime minister without much resistance from the broader public. All three were able to come to power off of the back of intense political insecurity and division, and it wasn't just the Axis powers that were racked with internal strife. Britain also had its flirtation with both fascism under Oswald Mosley and communism under Harry Pollitt. Likewise, France also saw intense political division as communist movements were driven underground by the French authorities. America was also split ideologically, as new technologies like the radio, which mirror social media today, allowed for a more and more diverse range of voices to participate in political discussion. Populists, such as Huey Long, were able to ride a wave of popular support, which galvanized the working class in America against inequality, whilst horrifying the existing institutions and conservatives within America. And anti-communist, pro-fascist movements, such as the German-American Bund and Silver Legion, also began to further entrench the political polarization, and America struggled to take a consistent, predictable stance in the face of rising ideological pressures abroad, led by a president who felt obliged to keep the USA out of any future conflicts and remain an isolationist power. We can't say for sure if China, Russia or Iran are embroiled in the same domestic ideological struggles that characterised the rise of World War II Axis leaders, since authoritarian systems don't allow for public discourse, the formation of effective opposition parties, or any reliable information on leader approval. But we can see that same turmoil that characterised France, Britain and the USA are appearing once again within the Western powers. Europe is currently having its own battle with the rise of far-right, anti-immigration and Eurosceptic parties keen to end the political liberalism that has characterised the post-war years. Likewise, America is locked in a tumultuous debate between the socially progressive woke and the alt-right America First MAGA movement. Despite his recent electoral victory, Donald Trump remains an immensely controversial president within America and garners admiration and hatred in almost equal measure. He also represents another slump into American isolationism, keen to put Americans first and take his eye off the ball on foreign affairs for the sake of popularity at home. Many Americans see the Ukraine war as a total waste of money, and I'd like to actually come in on that point for anyone who's tempted by that line of argument. The war in Ukraine does not represent a serious resource sink on the American economy or her resources. In April of 2024, Congress passed a bill of just over $63 billion in aid to Ukraine. Since the outbreak of the whole war, the US has spent around $175 billion over 2.5 years. It sounds like a lot, but divided by year, investment into Ukraine represents $70 billion, less than 0.3% of America's GDP in 2023. And this figure isn't even entirely accurate. A lot of these are actually inflated, as America slaps estimated price tags on US military backstock and then ships it off to Ukraine. A substantial portion of this equipment, by the way, was causing a headache for Uncle Sam as it required maintenance, storage and security to ensure it remained in the right hands. But even if this number of 175 billion were pinpoint spot on accurate, it's still a geopolitical bargain. America has the opportunity to grind an adversarial power down through years of attritional warfare, with no fatalities to American service personnel and at less than a percentage of yearly GDP. Sarah C.M. Payne, Professor of Strategy and Policy at the US Naval War College of Newport, described American aid to Ukraine as pennies on the dollar. But while there are many Americans who still see the Ukraine war as a resource sink, there are others within the US who go so far as to argue that Russia is acting defensively in the face of relentless NATO expansion, and as such should be allowed to swallow Ukraine whole. Whether through indifference to Ukraine or active support for Russia, Trump withdrawing military and financial aid from Kiev will allow the Kremlin a new opportunity to swallow Ukraine whole. And all of this will send a clear message that in our new multipolar world, the Axis powers have a mandate to consume whatever territory their strength and ambition will allow. Meanwhile, America and the other Western powers are unlikely to take proactive steps to check rising Axis aggression until domestic affairs are resolved and the nation can look beyond its own borders and collectively recognise the coming threat. And again, democracies don't go to war without popular support, because it's political suicide for a leader to force their nation into unpopular conflicts. Remember, the job of a democratic politician is not to stay alive like a dictator, but instead to be re-elected and/or build a positive legacy before leaving office. Which is exactly what happened during the lead up to World War II, where leaders were unable to galvanise enough support to come down hard on Axis aggression and instead followed a policy of appeasement to avoid another costly, unpopular war. When Germany was beginning to flex its muscles on its neighbours in the late 1930s, the world looked on with concern, but few resolute measures were taken to enforce the international rules. By 1938, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew to Munich to discuss matters with Hitler personally in an attempt to avoid the war. Hitler managed to cajole Chamberlain into an agreement in which the world would look the other way while he sliced off a third of Czechoslovakia. And in exchange, Germany would pinky promise to calm their territorial expansion. Chamberlain conceded to the terms and signed a document declaring that never again would the two countries go to war. He returned to London with the newly signed Munich Agreement to thunderous public applause. Chamberlain had guaranteed peace in our time. Winston Churchill, however, saw the agreement for what it was, a concession by Britain to Germany, and not a peace treaty or a check on German aggression. Despite popular support, the Munich Agreement ultimately failed to deliver on its promise. Within less than a year, Germany and Britain would be at war, after an emboldened Hitler decided to make another territorial grab, confident that Britain would once again look the other way in the name of peace. Instead, Britain chose conflict and declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. For many at the time, the sudden realisation that Britain and France were now at war with Germany came as an utter shock. Until that moment, another world war had been unthinkable. Which brings me onto my last and final point, number 8. Public opinion that war is impossible.
The proclamation of everlasting calm.
If you made it this far, well done, and frankly, thank you for giving me the time to make my arguments. My last point is very simple and quite short. Both before World War II and today, the public perception was that another global conflict wouldn't be possible. In the 1930s, the public was still reeling from the catastrophic and seemingly pointless waste of life during the First World War. Military technology had become even more devastating since that conflict, with new weapons and tactics being practiced in Spain, such as the first long-range heavy bombers, which could drop down into a town without warning and obliterate the people below. The artist Pablo Picasso witnessed one such bombing raid, which became the inspiration for this piece, La Guernica. It shows the aftermath of the explosion in his characteristic Cubism style: dismembered bodies, wounded animals, and people burning alive in a raging inferno. It was a shock expose on the reality of modern warfare, where there was no front line and everyone was a target. With these new toys and tactics, many believed another world war would be quite literally the end of the world. How could you even prosecute a war when your opponents could just carpet bomb your cities and towns, leaving everything shattered and everybody dead? We too, today, think that war is uniquely impossible because the threat of a nuclear holocaust will give any aggressor pause to think before taking any act of escalation or aggression. But if a dictator feels cornered and forced to act in order to protect his power, which is as good as his own life, it doesn't really matter if they perish under a mushroom cloud or at the hands of a popular revolt. Either way, they lose, and so it may be worth a roll of the dice and an escalation to war. In a 2020 YouGov poll, just 22% of Americans consider the World War would be very likely. That same year, a Pew Research survey found that the 3 most important issues to Americans were the economy, the environment, and the job situation. Global security and concerns about peace or a major conflict didn't even make the list. According to a more recent YouGov survey, this time in the UK, we saw that public anxiety about conflict spiked during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but this has since shrunk as the war fades from public consciousness. The indifference to warfare, or the belief that we're all safe, means that leaders don't face public pressure to take active steps on the international stage, and instead are hamstrung into compromises and half solutions so that they can play the part of peacemaker to voters back home, who are at best uninterested or outright suspicious of their leaders' conduct on foreign affairs, creating a window of opportunity that Axis powers can exploit, while the public within Western powers remains indifferent. A failure to comprehend the real dangers and potential avenues into war makes it all the more likely that we sleepwalk into a situation where conflict becomes inevitable, and due to lack of preparation, all the more costly and dangerous. So, what's my argument? What am I trying to say? Well, what I want to get across is that unlike 10 or 20 years ago, the world today is set up and primed for a global conflict that will be devastating beyond belief, and we have an unsettlingly similar set of circumstances to those that exploded into World War II mere decades ago. Now, none of this is to say, despite the title, that World War III is guaranteed. Geopolitics is unpredictable, and it's this difficulty to see future events which makes navigating crises such a dangerous business. But right now, we are in turbulent waters, and the colours are swirling on the floor, and the smell of gasoline is hanging under our nostrils. All it takes is one spark for all hell to be let loose. We often see history as something that once happened, that's behind us now, that we don't have to deal with anymore. This is folly. The future is written in the blood of our past.